Culture, at its most basic, is understood to be referred to as learned sets of ideas and behaviors that are acquired by people as members of society. Some anthropologists assert that the concept of culture has been forever tainted by the older usage that assigned every society its own unique, internally harmonious set of beliefs and practices. Because the use of this concept reflects an outmoded understanding of how societies and cultures relate to one another, they argue that it has permitted culture to be falsely understood as a prison house of custom from which people can never escape. The term should be discarded entirely. But abandoning the one society, one culture model does not mean that the concept of culture needs to be discarded. Many anthropologists who reject that model prefer to think of culture as the sum total of all of the customs and practices that humans have ever produced. Culture is flexible, dynamic, fluid, and living, and because culture is living and always changing, there is no right way to measure the culture of a people.
In the past, authenticity was simply in the eye of the beholder. Indians who looked Indian were authentic. Authenticity only became a problem for Native people in the 20th century. While it is true that mixed blood and full blood rivalries predate this period, the question of who was an Indian and who was not was easier to settle. What made it easy was that most Indians lived on reserves of one sort or another, out of sight of Europeans, and had strong ties to a particular community. And the majority of those people who looked Indians, and those who did not, at least had a culture and a language in common. This is no longer as true as it once was, for many Native people now live in cities with only tenuous ties to a reserve or a nation. Many no longer speak their native language, a gift of colonialism. And the question of identity has become as much a personal matter as it is a matter of blood. N. Scott Momaday has suggested that being Native is an idea that an individual has of themselves. Momaday, who is Kiowa, is not suggesting that anyone who wants to can imagine themselves to be an Indian. He is simply acknowledging that language and the narrow definitions of culture are not the only ways identity can be constructed.
Edward Curtis, a photographer in the early 1900s, wanted to photograph the dying race of the Indians. What Curtis did was take a box of clothing for the Indians to wear. What this did was put Aboriginal people in a box and set a standard for what they should look like. As we now know, this is not what Aboriginal people look like today, and in many cases they have not looked like this at all throughout history. These staged photos were used to measure the Indianness of Aboriginal people, and those who did not fit the description named by Curtis were not considered Aboriginal.
Door. The cliches that we can't rewind. But I'm not the Indian you had in mind.
I'm not the Indian you had in mind. I've known him. Oh, I've known him well. The bare-greased hair, the pungent smell, the piercing eye, the startling yell. Thank God he's the friendly kind. But I'm not the Indian you had in mind.
The same goes for Aboriginal art. Art, like culture, is also living and changing. Just because Aboriginal artists may not sew moccasins, bead keychains, or make birch bark rogans does not mean that their art cannot be called Aboriginal art or that they cannot identify as an Aboriginal artist. Take the Michael family in Fort Chipewyan, for example. Karen often makes birch bark baskets with her mother, Gracie, while her cousin Trevor makes a different form of art. Both of these individuals can be identified as an Aboriginal artist.
There's both power and healing for Aboriginal communities in knowing and telling their stories and sharing their histories. Art is a medium for making clear the silencing and negation of Aboriginal people in Canada while still maintaining their distinct cultures and identities within today's society. Art, whether Aboriginal or not, often bears close ties to the artist's community and personal history, as well as locating them within their culture and in Aboriginal art. Both artist and viewer are able to engage with various experiences of Aboriginal culture and history. The continuing practice of art by Aboriginal people is testament to its ability to both heal and sustain communities, simultaneously aiding as an outlet for Aboriginal people's recovery from a colonial past and present. Because Indigenous knowledge is so often carried and shared through various forms of verbal and nonverbal communication, such as ceremony, storytelling, dance, song, visual arts, and handicrafts, it is important that Aboriginal artists are free to express the message of their art without being placed in a box, even if these mediums aren't common in more mainstream Western art. Too often, however, these forms for communicating knowledge, when they are expressed to and perceived by the outside world, are often translated and or restricted by those who have the power to determine what is and isn't worth knowing. If Aboriginal art that doesn't fit within the scope of acceptable mediums in Western art, it can simply be deemed as ethnic art and quickly devalued and dismissed from the art world. The art pieces created by today's Aboriginal artists are not artifacts from a long-dead civilization or souvenirs manufactured to suit an irrelevant aesthetic. By placing these techniques or art styles in the past, it is easy to ignore their relevance and continued importance in the present. Aboriginal artists deserve the same freedom of creativity afforded all artists to create work that is meaningful to them and best presents the message of their piece through the means they have chosen, whether or not this conforms to Eurocentric standards for real art, or what native art should look like. Art and artistic expression through both traditional and modern means is a path to healing for many Aboriginal people and communities. Members of the artistic community, curators, gallery owners, viewers, etc., have a responsibility moving forward to allow Aboriginal artists the freedom to create and to take those creations seriously. We must see Aboriginal art as coming from a living, breathing, surviving culture, and not see traditional crafts still in practice as the same artifacts from hundreds of years before. In this way, we can create space for artists to move forward in Aboriginal culture rather than space to only look back.
For the past 40 years, feminists have said that the personal is the political, and making art is a very personal act that is sometimes shared and sometimes not. A personal response to one's own role within society can have very political meanings, especially if the individual is one that is marginalized by the majority of the population. I argue that almost all art can be political. Art can inspire thought and reflection, and thus social change. Art can also be an outlet for the artist to express their hurt and anger, and thus begin their own healing. So, social change and personal identity are intertwined into developing one's own ideology. Art has been a way for individuals to determine their own self-identity and explore who and what they are. Artists, like everyone else, are affected by the society they live in. We see art expressing the journey of self-awareness. Sometimes this takes the form of an oil painting of sunflowers in a field, and sometimes this takes the form of a spray-painted mural on the side of a train car. Paying attention to light posts you can see between advertisements for bands and lost cats, posters about changing rape culture, and government policy. Besides this guerrilla style of street art, there are also artists inciting social change in our art galleries. Currently in the Art Gallery of Alberta, there is an installation by a Rich Lake artist named Amy Malbouf, who mixes traditional Aboriginal and modern art to create pieces that say things like, "We may be oppressed, but at least we aren't depressed," and thus illustrating the resilience of First Nations people in regards to the oppression inflicted on them by Canadian society. First Nations people in Canada have been and continue to be systemically oppressed. First Nations communities are dealing with the effects of genocide and systemic racism. Art can be a platform for First Nations people to share their experiences of fighting oppression and determining self-identity. Art can allow for reclamation of traditional art and craft. Art gives a voice to the oppressed and without having to bow to the expectations of the oppressor. Art can allow the artist to heal. Art allows for First Nations people to express what it means to them to be First Nations. Art can be used to redefine what First Nations people are on their own terms.